Forget everything you think you know about Vikings. Forget the horned helmets they never wore and the sweeping romances from the movies. Instead, imagine a smoky, cramped longhouse. The air is thick with the smell of sweat and burning peat. In this world, you don't choose who you marry. Your marriage is a contract. The woman next to you might just be one of several in your household. And your honor, your entire place in society, hinges on a rigid code of sexual conduct that would shatter our modern ideas of love and life. The Vikings didn't just conquer lands with axes. They built their empire through a complex and often brutal web of sexual customs. This wasn't about love. It was a cold calculation for power, politics, and dominance. And we're about to uncover the shocking truth of it all. Most of our ideas about Vikings come from pop culture. Fiercely loyal husbands and wives, shield maidens fighting side by side with their men. A society that, while violent, had a kind of romantic honor. The real story? It was far grimmer. Viking society was forged in a world of scarcity and survival. Life was short, the land was harsh, and every decision was a calculated risk. This brutal environment shaped everything, especially their views on sex, family, and power. Gender roles were usually strict. Men were expected to be out in the world, the Jotun stocks, or outside the threshold, as warriors, traders, and farmers. Women, on the other hand, were in charge of the world in stocks, within the threshold. They ran the farm, managed the finances, and ruled the household. Now, Norse women did have more rights than many of their European neighbors. They could inherit property and even initiate a divorce, but they were still living in a man's world. And this world wasn't built on romance. It was built on pragmatism. Every marriage, every child, and every sexual act was weighed by one question. Does this make the family stronger? Their approach to sex wasn't bogged down by our ideas of sin or shame. It was just a normal, powerful part of life. But that openness didn't mean it was a free-for-all. Quite the opposite. Sex was so important that it was heavily regulated, not by morality, but by a brutal code of honor. The rules were complex, the stakes were lethally high, and it all served a single purpose: getting and keeping power. For the Vikings, getting married rarely had anything to do with falling in love. For most people, and especially the powerful, marriage was a strategic alliance. Think of it less like a wedding and more like a corporate merger between two families. The goal wasn't happiness. It was to consolidate power, grab more land, forge political ties, or even stop a bloody feud between clans. The whole thing kicked off with a negotiation called the festarmal, or betrothal. Here, the groom's family hammered out a deal with the bride's father. The woman's consent wasn't legally required, though a smart father might ask his daughter's opinion just to keep the peace. A key part of the deal was the munder, or bride price. This wasn't about buying a wife, but more like compensation to her family for losing her labor, and to prove the groom could actually provide for her. In return, the bride brought a dowry, or hymen filja, which was her own personal property, and acted as her financial safety net. These were legally binding contracts, and the wedding itself was a public announcement of this new deal, often sealed with feasts that went on for days. Even the wedding night was a semi-public event. To make the marriage legally binding, a handful of witnesses would often escort the newlyweds to their bedchamber. This wasn't about spying. It was to show that the community was invested in this union and its main purpose: creating legitimate heirs to carry on the family name and inherit its wealth. Women were often the currency in these deals, bartered to build networks of power. This cold, calculated approach to marriage was the bedrock of Viking society, a world where personal feelings always came second to the ambitions of the clan. A Viking chieftain's household often included more than just one wife and her kids. Having multiple partners, concubines, and sometimes multiple wives was common. especially for the rich and powerful. A wealthy man might have his main wife, the matriarch of the household, and then several concubines, known as filier. These relationships were a flashing neon sign of status. The more women a man could support, the bigger the man he was seen to be. So where did all these other women come from? Many of them were captives. Viking raids weren't just for gold and silver. They were for people. Women were a primary target, kidnapped from places like Ireland, England, and Slavic territories, and dragged back to Scandinavia. Genetic evidence from Iceland tells a powerful story. The male lineage is mostly Norse, while the female lineage is heavily Gaelic. This suggests that while some women may have come through marriage or migration, many of the founding women of Iceland were likely brought there as captives. Once captured, a woman's fate was grim. She could become a thrall, the Viking word for a slave. Thralls were property, and the law gave a master sexual rights over his female thralls. While we can't know how every master behaved, this right was a normal and terrifying part of a thrall's existence. Some women weren't kept as slaves, but were made concubines. This was a step up in status, but it was still a life of servitude, totally dependent on the master's whims. This system created a dark, vicious cycle. With the richest men taking multiple partners, it likely created a shortage of available wives for lower status men. This fierce competition for a partner may have been a powerful motivator for young men to go a Viking, to raid foreign lands to get the wealth. And the women, they needed to start their own families and build a reputation. The capture of women wasn't just a byproduct of raiding. It was one of its main goals. It was a way to humiliate enemies and fuel the Viking engine of expansion, all on the backs of captive women. In the Viking world, honor was everything, and it was policed by a razor-sharp set of social and sexual rules. They may not have had our Christian ideas of sin, but they were obsessed with a concept called ergia word, that roughly translates to unmanly or effeminate. For a man, the worst thing you could possibly be was sexually passive. To be the receptive partner in a sex act, by choice or by force, was to be labeled arger. This wasn't just an insult. It was social suicide. According to old Icelandic law codes, accusing a man of ergi was so serious, it was one of the few insults that gave the accused the legal right to kill you on the spot. No questions asked. This terror of being seen as unmanly created intense pressure on men to perform a specific aggressive version of masculinity at all times. The double standard was immense. A married man could sleep with his concubines and thralls with almost no social backlash. His infidelity wasn't the problem. As long as he was the dominant one, his honor was safe. For a woman, however, the rules were absolute. A wife's adultery was a massive blow to her husband's honor, because it cast doubt on who his real heirs were. And depending on the local laws, a husband who caught his wife with another man might even be legally justified in killing them both on the spot. This obsession with sexual dominance was a weapon. Humiliating a rival often involved brutal insults designed to brand them as arger and strip them of their masculinity. The accusation alone was a social execution, a way to destroy a man's honor and status without ever lifting an axe. It was a powerful tool for social control that kept the hyper-masculine warrior ethos firmly in place. When you put all the pieces together, the strategic marriages, the institutionalized concubines, the capture of women, and the brutal honor codes, the picture becomes crystal clear. The shocking sexual practices of the Vikings weren't just random acts of barbarism. They were the gears of a complex machine built for one purpose: to gain and hold on to power. For the elite, marriage and concubinage were political chess moves. Having multiple partners allowed a chieftain to create alliances with many families, building a huge network of kin who owed him their support. It also meant more children, more sons to be his heirs, and more daughters to be married off for even more strategic gains. It was a numbers game, and people were the currency. The capture of women in raids served two functions. First, it supplied the women needed to keep a polygynous society going. Second, it was a direct economic boost to the slave trade. Viking slave markets, like the one in Dublin, were infamous for trafficking human beings, especially women and girls captured on raids. This flood of free labor and breeding potential was crucial for the expansion of Viking settlements across the North Atlantic. And the whole thing was held together by that rigid honor code. The fear of being seen as weak or unmanly drove men to incredible acts of violence and risk-taking. It fueled the raids that brought back the wealth and captives, which raised a man's status, which allowed him to get a wife and support concubines, which proved his power. It was a perfectly interlocking system where sex, honor, and violence could not be separated. The Viking world was a place of stark contradictions. It was a society that granted women certain legal rights, yet built an economy on their capture and sexual enslavement. It was a culture that could be open about sex, yet would justify killing a man for a single word that questioned his manhood. Viewed through our eyes, their customs are undeniably shocking. But to the Vikings, this wasn't about good versus evil. It was about survival and ambition. These practices were the engine that drove their society. They built alliances, secured legacies, and fueled the relentless expansion that defined the Viking Age. Their web of sexual customs was a calculated, and often cruel, tool for forcing order onto a violent world. It shows us that the greatest weapons the Vikings had weren't just the axe and the longship, but the strategic control of marriage, procreation, and desire itself. The shocking truth is that for the Vikings, sex was never just sex. It was power,